people don't understand that palliative care has not been around that long. Part of the real great demand for palliative care right now, I mean, you're incredibly unique because of the pediatric focus, but the reality is there's a lot of conversations. People don't understand that hospice is a type of palliative care, and palliative care is a specialty that is focused on how do we ensure people are as comfortable as possible when we know that there is an end in sight. In palliative care, there's this integrated model of palliative care, and it's like there's the heroic intervention until there's nothing else to be offered. But people oftentimes aren't actually offered and do you know when you want to opt out? Do you know where do you want that little one to die? Do you envision it being in a medicalized supportive environment? Or do you imagine lying in bed with your little one beside you with a hospice kit and a phone number of who to call when you're ready?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Riley, the host of the Holistic OBGYN podcast. If you're new here, most of the conversations are not going to be obviously relevant to the childbirth experience. Because what we love to talk about with birth is, hey, we need living moms and living babies at all costs, right? And whatever we're doing, if it isn't leading to living moms and living babies, we're probably doing it wrong. And yet we have a medical industrial complex that is hell-bent on utilizing more interventions and more data and more objectified ways of approaching childbirth that are quite simply not working all that well. And this myriad of tools that I invested nearly $500,000 into certainly didn't prepare me very well for the inevitable bad outcome. Babies die, fetuses die, we're all going to die. And yet our death illiteracy leads to so much trauma in the wake of a bad outcome that even us seasoned veterans within the health professions often struggle with how to show up when death inevitably shows up on our doorstep. But we really never expect to see this happen in childbirth, right? It does happen. In fact, it's happened in my circles a couple times recently. But because we don't talk about mortality, right? Even when Grandpa Joe, 99, dies of heart failure, we don't really talk about it. So this has developed into what my guest today, Tamara MacIntyre. She's a retired chiropractor. She calls herself an end-of-life architect, which I think is so lovely. She tries to help families grapple with this reality. And I learned about Tamara through the Prana Foundation and her partner, Dr. Monique Andrews. They've both been on the podcast, and I recommend going back and listening to that. What I learned from them was this polyvagal theory, this sort of theoretical framework for how the nervous system responds to bad things. And of course, in birth and death and everything in between, our nervous system really doesn't know the difference between something bad or good happening on the outside. All that it knows is that it either feels threatened or safe. And the way that we approach childbirth leaves a lot of people not feeling very safe. And that, of course, is going to impact the childbirth experience as a whole. But how we show up whenever there's inevitably a bad outcome that's coming, let's say a 23-weeker with anencephaly, is being born, there's not a lot that we can do. And so what we do is we withdraw instead of really leaning in order to provide human-to-human care. And if you consider the dehumanization of doctors as they go through this years and years and years of medical training, when you consider just how dehumanizing that is, it's no surprise that we, after our training, feel completely inadequate and really unprepared to help navigate these complicated scenarios that arise, specifically when a mom, a baby, or a fetus dies. So this is a very heartfelt conversation that I have with Dr. MacIntyre. And we get into death, we get into grief, we get into souls, we get into loss in general, right? It doesn't have to be a baby dying at 39 weeks, which I've also helped with, or a baby that is born at home at 37 weeks without a brain, or a baby that's born prematurely in the hospital without a trachea. It could also just be a recurrent miscarriage, which is unique in that a woman may be pregnant and then they suddenly don't feel pregnant, but there's still this lingering feeling that they're a mother. So this stuff really, really matters. And if there's something in this episode that you really love, share it with your friends. I'm going to be incorporating this interview into a new free program that Sarah Rosser and I, through the Born Free Method, are launching around really when things don't go as planned. And that includes all of the things I've mentioned. And sometimes when these hard decisions arise, I think we as a society at large don't do a great job of rallying the horses around this expectant mother who still feels like a mother, but is left without a living baby in her arms after 9.5 months of pregnancy. So this is a very, very rich conversation. It's a very gentle conversation, and I really encourage you to approach it with love and light and not shame and guilt. Really, they don't play any part here. We're all grieving. We're all mourning something at some point in our life, if not right now. And so I really extend an invitation to you to come into this one really with an open heart, and we'll see what comes out of that. Before we do, I've got two companies that help keep the lights on here. The first is Immune Intel AHCC. This is a whole food supplement made from the mycelia of shiitake mushrooms that has helped countless women now clear HPV, get their cervical health, and their overall immune system back in order. I don't like a lot of supplements. I really don't. But this is one that works so well that I don't get commissions or anything. I just want you to go and support this brand. And they are graciously providing me a little bit of support to keep this podcast going because I love doing this show. And I really, really love the people that made this, Chase Ramey and Mimi Lindquist. Mimi and I have a program called Clear and Free, your holistic solution to persistent HPV. And if you want to find out more about that, go to clearhpv.com. And when people enroll, we send them a bottle of Immune Intel AHCC because it just works so well. That's a complimentary bottle. So if you want to try this outside of the Clear and Free, if you're just interested in this, if you have a friend that can benefit from some support, they've got an abnormal pap, they're facing a painful biopsy, maybe a LEEP procedure, maybe a hysterectomy because of these abnormal paps or persistent HPV signals coming up on the swabs, you can go to themedicine.com. That's THEMEDICIN.com. Use code beloved10. You'll save 10%. Stock up. I recommend 2 to 4 capsules twice a day for the 3 months in starting, your reclamation of health. But if you add on a variety of lifestyle modifications, which we go into in depth in our program, you're really, really going to set yourself up for a long life of happy, healthy self and family. I'll just say that. So check them out. I really, really love this brand. And then, of course, our other sponsor is WeNatal. They make the best prenatal vitamin on the market. It's 3 capsules per day with the same nutrition that you would get from other brands that are also great brands, but we're looking at 10 to 15 capsules a day. I love this brand because they only do 3 things. They do a his prenatal, a her prenatal, and they do a fish oil, omega DHA plus. And for a limited time, you can go to wenatal.com/beloved, add any of their prenatal products to your cart and add a bottle of omega DHA plus, and they will send that bottle of fish oil to you complimentary. So I love this brand. They're very, very eco-conscious. They it's created by women who have grappled with their own challenges in pregnancy and childbirth and through fertility and all of that. And this is the only brand I recommend to people nowadays. So they also have a mind body journal they send to you because they know that that's equally a part of this as getting the right amount of nutrients and vitamins into your diet. So go to wenatal.com/beloved, take advantage of that free bottle of omega DHA plus. There's a reason that both myself and Mark Hyman, who's my mentor in functional medicine, are both endorsing this brand because the people who are behind it, Vita and Ronit, they are just amazing. We've had them on the podcast. Go and check out that episode if you want to learn more about this company. But between Immune Intel AHCC and WeNatal, it's a big part of offsetting the costs of running a podcast of this caliber. So thank you to both of them. If anything in this episode or otherwise touches you in any way, please share with your friends. Leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. We are on YouTube now, so go subscribe there. We have a growing channel there, some nice conversations happening in the comments. And this conversation will definitely generate some interesting conversation. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation, please, with retired chiropractor, end-of-life architect, Tamara MacIntyre. Tamara, you're back on the podcast. You and Dr. Mo, both chiropractors, you were here before, and we were talking about some lighter stuff, I suppose. Nothing really related to the nervous system and supporting childbirth and whatnot is light. But in contrast to what we're going to talk about today, which is largely death, dying, and this end of life continuum, which sometimes, as people listening probably know, hopefully you don't know this personally because you lost a baby. And if so, this might be a conversation that you want to just take in pieces, and feel free to pause it or to delete it altogether if it's not for you. But at some point, I do think that this conversation is going to be helpful to you. And it certainly is to the community at large, because we have this well-seated fear of death. Tamara, tell me, where does this fear come from? Why are we so compelled to avoid not just the conversation, but mortality itself?
Yeah. I mean, well, first I would say, Nathan, we are in a relatively death illiterate time, in a culture that doesn't understand that there is innate wisdom that brings a baby into the world, and we have innate wisdom that shuts the body down at the end of life. And so we tend to not have an experience. And then when we do have an experience being very close up to death, we tend to be very traumatized by it because it is so unexpected. And so to answer your question, I would say that in general, there are two, when you ask and sort of identify like what is the root of the fear, there tends to be two places. One, people will say, if I say, do you know what what you're afraid of? And generally it falls into two categories. One, the fear of being in pain and suffering. So the root of fear tends to be that fear. The second is the fear of being dead. And that tends to be more existential. Like, what was this all about? What are we doing here? Like and especially in the loss of a baby, then there is how do you reconcile that?
Right.
I mean, they're supposed to be born perfect. They're meant to be here, for a long time. I'm the parent. I'm meant to, outlive my child. And then when your child dies, then there's an existential component.
Sure.
The other thing that's, so when we say there's fear, there is different roots of fear. And, there's this concept within end of life that is, there's the triad of certainty. One, life is finite. Two, there's no do-overs. It's only going to play out one way. And three, we will leave loved ones behind. And when we talk about death literacy or, what I say, death education, we have to be willing to be more curious than afraid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of my job, is to guide that conversation in terms of where do we have some level of curiosity, and that's where we can open the door. The other part, and I'm sure you see this in so many of the families and parents, is that I have for many, many years talked about fostering agency. And I had somebody, more recently say, well, what is agency? And it's the ability to make good decisions. And that's incredibly difficult when we're in the terrain of a difficult diagnosis, or, a birth that doesn't go as planned, or a baby's life and death is unexpected. And so it's like, how do you inspire an individual to understand that even in the worst of circumstances, there still is the ability to make decisions that are congruent with your values. There's still the ability to better understand the circumstance, because really illness, dying, and death is mostly defaulted to the medical community. There's the lack of understanding that your role as a physician is to choose quantity of life. I mean, that's just the nature. You can't choose quality unless you were given
Right.
permission to do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think a lot of times people don't understand that when you default decisions to the medical community, then the decisions are always going to be rooted in quantity of life. And that may actually pose some incongruency for you. If
Yeah.
what you ultimately want for your child, if you ultimately want for that experience of an illness, if you want to choose quality of life, the only way that's going to happen is if you fully understand and you are armed with all of the possible information as far as
Right.
risks and benefits and what's the trajectory of this illness is going to look like. And when my baby's born, what do I expect? How long do you think they're going to be here with me? How much time are we going to have? Are there choices in terms of what you're going to offer to try to prolong their life? And what's
Yeah.
that going to actually really look like?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So those kind of conversations tend to be really very much missing in fostering agency in our patients. And many physicians will try their best, but they forget, I think, sometimes that, and research says this is the case. Some of the most difficult conversations for physicians to have, therefore they are humans and they avoid having them, is what's the prognosis? And prognosis, if
Right.
you even just look at definition, prognosis is an art, which means it requires a lot of experience. And oftentimes these are very unique circumstances with, a lot of complexity to them. So there is a prognosis is an art of understanding the trajectory of what's actually truly happening. It involves judgment, which physicians don't necessarily want to do. And so it kind of stays in the air, and families don't even get the understanding or opportunity to understand that this little life is going to be finite. And without intervention, this is what it's going to look like. And with intervention, this is what it's going to look like. And if your wishes for you and your family are to be with your little one until they take their last breath, where do you imagine that is? Have you thought about what a good death is going to look like for you and your family?
Bingo.
Are there siblings? And what opportunity do we want to give those siblings to actually integrate death into their life without trauma moving
Yeah.
forward, right? There's
Yeah.
all of that complexity. So long answer, but there's a lot of roots of where the fear is coming from. And I think ultimately it's a lack of experience, a lack of exposure, a lack of willingness of those in supportive environments, and just really, truly a lack of resources.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people like me are far and few between. The palliative care doctors around the country are still so limited that I'm getting job offers that are like $400K a year with a $100,000 signing bonus to move to wherever,
Mm-hmm.
South Dakota.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a big portion of our country, which is a massive country, guys. Drive across the country and then drive back and tell me you aren't in a land of many, many faces. And most of that central part of the United States doesn't have access to these types of conversations. And fortunately, at consciousdeath.org, you are providing people a resource for that. I'd like to, whenever they can't consult with me, I tend to be called about the perinatal palliative care, crises that emerge. And I'll share a story about that in a second. Well, actually, let me just share that. It's very, very brief. Let me share that. Just a week ago or so, I was getting a haircut, and as I was leaving, my phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was a good midwife friend of mine, and she said, "I've got a big problem here in California. There's a baby that I've been caring for, this family, and the baby was found to have this very rare genetic disorder. There's no fix for it. It's not something that we say, well, let's go into the experimental trials. It's not like that. It's a condition whereby there's such a malformation that it's incompatible with life. However, because it's so rare, the data, right, would say this baby could live up to a year, or the baby may not survive childbirth. And so, of course, the OBGYN and the MFM, they're trying to be as honest as they can, but they're dangling this carrot of, but your baby might live a year. Wouldn't you want that? I'm putting words now into the conversation because I've heard those things said. Wouldn't you want your baby to at least have a year? Like, wouldn't that be a great year? Well, maybe not. What if this baby needs every little tube and bag and changed and force fed, and it could be catastrophic for a family that has other children. I mean, this could totally shape the dynamic. And then if we layer on religious and cultural
percepts as to what's a good or bad life, we end up with a pickle. So I got on the phone with them and I said, I'm not taking any money for this. Let's just have a conversation. I'll be your hospice doc. And I drew from a book chapter that I wrote on perinatal palliative care around trisomy 18. Trisomy 18 is a genetic, it's an aneuploidy whereby you can have a range of issues, including massive cardiac malformations. Some of those babies don't even develop a brain, a condition called anencephaly, where there's a brain stem but not a brain, like not the cortex, that makes us, so unique from a lot of our other living organisms. And I drew from that, and it was like, listen, we have a responsibility here, not just to the baby, but also to the family, to make sure that this isn't more traumatic than it otherwise has to be. So when you talk about, providing the risks and the benefits, it's the risks, benefits, alternatives to literally every aspect of this entire story that's unfolding. And that requires some special training, some special presence. Having messed this up in the past as a fellow, it put me in a unique position to help them. The baby did pass away moments after birth, and I got photos, and this woman and her husband are holding them in the birth tub and just loving her or him. I can't remember. But the point of the story is that our perception of what a good life is, forget about death. Everybody's so afraid of death that we forget to live. So this good life thing, this illusion of a good life, Stephen Jenkinson would put it this way. He's like, listen, that little baby is going to be loved for its entire time here. It could be loved without any pain, with feeling safe. We'll get into some polyvagal techniques around safety. But you use the word trauma, and I think that's very important because the birth of this baby is going to be burdened. Whatever the outcome is going to be burdened by their living family members, perhaps for the rest of their life. Yeah, for sure, for the rest of their life. And grief, you bring up grief quite a bit. Nora McInerney, she did this great TED Talk on the death of her husband and how the mourning process and this grief process does not heal with time. It's actually a part of your story now. And once you can open yourself up to that, this conversation around a baby that may die, and I'm not using fancy little words like transition or anything. I'm saying the baby will not be here anymore. And hopefully the baby's going to a better place. Who cares? The point is right now in this moment, what can we do? What is the person's values, the birthing woman and her partner? What are their values? What are their belief systems? What is really important to them in order to love their little child, even if it's for minutes? And that's where I think your work is just so uniquely special. So I'll pause there because I said a lot more than I was hoping, but do you have anything you want to, reflect on there?
Well, I'd start from, at the very beginning when you said about palliative. People don't understand that palliative care has not been around that long.
Right.
And
like maybe 30 years.
Right. Maybe. And so having said that, part of the real great demand for palliative care right now, you're incredibly unique because of the pediatric focus. But the reality is there's a lot of conversations. People don't understand that hospice is a type of palliative care. And palliative care is a specialty that is focused on how do we ensure people are as comfortable as possible when we know that there is an end in sight. Right. And so that tends to be, that is its focus. And then the other piece is that in palliative care, there's this integrated model of palliative care, and it's like there's the heroic intervention until there's nothing else to be offered. But people oftentimes aren't actually offered and do you know when you want to opt out?
Right.
Do you know where, like, if where do you want that little one to die?
Yeah.
Do you envision it being in a medicalized supportive environment? Or do you imagine lying in bed with your little one beside you with a hospice kit and a phone number of who to call when you're ready? Right. I had a former student of mine who, very similar to the story that you just shared, former student of mine, I get a call. There's, their newborn baby, less than a week old. They notice that there are some lumps on this body that doesn't feel right. This is their first child. Long story short, we end up with a very aggressive cancer. And we know the lifespan is very short. And in a newborn. Ultimately, the life of this little boy was 6 weeks. And we still celebrated the birth of this little boy. And I went to their home and met them as a family. And you know, it, while they knew the life was limited, there was this beauty of clarity associated with what is life really all about? Love.
Mm.
And this little soul could not have been more loved in those 6 weeks. Like, what an incredible gift. And we live in a society where a successful life or a high-end quality life is about days in our lives as opposed to the quality that we pack in our days. And so this family made some really stunning decisions. They chose to not pursue a lot of intervention. They chose to be at home so that friends, family could be in that environment with them. They chose to establish a relationship with hospice. They chose to educate themselves associated with if these scenarios played out, what could they do themselves in the privacy and the intimacy of parenting this little one and escorting him and his soul out. They chose to allow him to die at home. They chose to wait before they called, because the reality is dying is not a medical emergency.
Mm.
Most parents have, because they are providing all essential forms that sustain life. They are providing food and shelter and love to this little being. And so they have a relationship with this little body. And we know that if parents are allowed to have a relationship with the physical vessel when the soul is no longer there, if you do believe in souls, that time and space that they can relate to the vessel that no longer has life in it, they tend to actually have a healthier grieving process.
Wow.
And so this family chose to wait until they were ready to pick up the phone and have somebody come and collect this little body. They chose to cremate the body. They chose to take some of those ashes and make it into put it into tattoo ink. They chose to
Oh, I've
tattoo
never heard
themselves
of
with a
that.
little bit. Yeah. So they chose to put some of his cremains, which is what that's called, the ash. The ash goes into ink, and they chose to place a tattoo, the same tattoo that was meaningful for their little boy. And the memory is now the oldest brother of the two kids they've had afterwards. These two other, little girl and little boy, know that they had an older brother that they never got to meet.
Wow.
We use his name, right? We use his name because he exists. And so this family chose to do it really differently and really thoughtfully. And even in just what I've conveyed to you about their story, that was how they grieved. And so people kind of, sort of don't even know the difference. Like we don't even know the difference. Like, bereavement is the time frame associated with the grief process. A lot of people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Well, 5 stages of grief is only if you are the person dying.
Right.
That does not refer to you as the person grieving, the parents grieving the loss of your child. It's said that grief, when you are the parent, when you are the person that has lost, there is who you were before and there is who you are after.
Yeah.
And the stages of bereavement and what that looks like in terms of the grief process. Grief is so personal. It's what happens inside of us. Mourning is what people see on the outside, but they don't know the pain that you're experiencing in that whole grief. And so, even just to understand, like, this family I just described, of course, there's the shock and the numbness and they can't get their head around the fact that this little baby has a finite life that they were not expecting. And then, there's that searching and yearning and wanting for something else, but then they still have this little being that's with them for this finite amount of time that they want to be present. And so there will be time later on for being disoriented and did that, like relating to it in a real practical kind of way. And that grief needs to be expressed as well. And then, do you ever resolve, like, does grief ever stop? Do you ever outgrow it? No.
Yeah.
They will always grieve the loss of their firstborn.
Like, can I say
And it
something
will,
to that? Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
please.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you mentioned Kubler-Ross, and a quote just emerged, and she
Mhm.
had said something which brought me so much sustenance, I'll say, like energetic
Mhm.
sustenance. It gave me language that somebody like Kubler-Ross, who was a pioneer in this field way back in the day, Germany, um, something that she said was when a mother loses a child, she spoke to mother, but of course we can say the whole family, everybody in that sphere is going to
Mhm.
feel some degree of this grief, this mourning process. She reminded
Right.
her readers in one of her books that that mother is not grieving just the loss of her child. She's
Mhm.
also grieving the entire dream she had of what her family was going to look like for the next 18 plus years with that child now,
Right.
breastfeeding
Which is
that
why it
child.
continues. Which is why it continues, Nathan. Like
Yeah,
that's why grieving never goes away, because you're never, you know, the first of all of those things. Even when you experience it with your other child, you are still going to be reflective of the lack of that experience with your
right,
firstborn.
right,
Right. Or so everything that happens, I mean, the death of your own parent, it's like, my child never got to, it's like everything that you want to celebrate in life and everything that feels really hard moving forward, they're still with you.
right.
And one of the things that I always sort of say, like, and I've said for years, when somebody is experiencing an incredible loss in their life, we say we've lost somebody. Right. I mean, that's the lexicon. Like, there's so much wrong with death lexicon, but to lose somebody, I always sort of remind them, like, what this is not what you would have imagined. And um, you didn't lose that relationship. The relationship has changed.
Mm,
And that's what you're grieving, you know?
yeah,
Um, and so to understand that it's a different relationship, but that it will always be there. And different religions and different cultures relate to the people in their lives that they've loved that have gone in different ways. There's many cultures and religions where there is the belief you continue to talk to them. There is, like in Buddhism, there's a 40-day bardo. There's this
yeah,
window of time where you keep offering food, and windows of time associated when the vessel needs to be taken care of, however that is for that particular religion or spiritual faith. Quickly, if you're Jewish, it's like different religions have different time frames, but the reality is the grief is that the relationship has changed.
right.
I was speaking to a medical doctor who writes poetry, and it was part of her process. And I said to her, I think sometimes people forget that the moment that a diagnosis happens, or the moment the prognosis is not what you expected, or the moment that you see that what you imagined is not going to come to fruition, or is not going to play out the way you imagined, there is grief.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Right. And that is a known experience that we all will have, but that we rarely talk about.
right.
Right. And even just, I mean, if I was to say to you, like, there's a lot of different types of grief. There's delayed grief, and there's anxiety grief, and then there's also what happens in miscarriage, which is called disenfranchised grief. Which is, miscarriage is so common that we don't actually allow the depth of grief and pain with the loss of all that they imagined it was going to be with this pregnancy. And so disenfranchised grief is actually a specialty within the end of life doula realm, because the reality is it's so common, and so rarely, women are so rarely well supported in miscarriage. It's like, "Oh, it's okay, you can try again. Oh, it's
Well,
okay,
yeah,
just because you had one, or you're on number 3 and you're wondering, what else can I be doing? What else can be investigated? What else can you medically explore?" And
right.
that cumulative miscarriage just builds a grief process that is hugely traumatic to many women who experience miscarriage.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously can speak to this as an OBGYN. We see a lot of miscarriage, but we're in a place where we've been given this role of being the first person to see that there's no heartbeat, or it's been 2 weeks and we still don't have an embryo. It's a chemical pregnancy. We come up with all these, like, again, fancy terms that actually bypass the reality that, first off, when you walk into the room, hey, congrats, you're pregnant, is actually not the first thing to say, because they may not have been wanting to get pregnant in the first place. This may have been, an accident, or whatever language people want to use. This could have been an unwanted sexual interaction. They might be there by themselves and very afraid of what's going to come out of your mouth. So from the moment a woman goes to her doctor, which advertises the illusion of safety, and I'm not going to get into doctor bashing. I would love for more OBGYNs to just hear what I'm saying. You're being vested with this important role of not only using appropriate language, meeting them where they're at, getting to know who they are. It takes maybe 5 minutes to really appreciate why they're there with you before you shove a phallic device inside their vagina and start waving it around like an Atari game in order to see something on a screen. And what I was modeled was, they're focused on the screen and their hands doing this thing inside of them. And the longer that you wait to say something good, assuming they're hoping for some good news, like they've been trying for 6 years to get pregnant or whatever, the more grief actually sets in. Because if you took too long to see the heartbeat, for example, or you were just looking at some other things before you said what you saw, they have already had this seed of doubt that it didn't stick or it didn't hold. So, and then of course, if it is a miscarriage, I remember one of my attendings went in and it was a surgical resident with his wife. And I knew him because general surgery and OBs share a lot of the same ORs. And he was a year ahead of me in residency and I knew him very well. We'll call him Jim. So I went in and I was like, oh, hey, Jim, and here's my wife. Oh, hi, wife, and it's good getting to know him, getting to know her a little bit. And I knew him and I knew he was excited because he was telling me I think we did it. Like, I got a positive test. And so I said, come and see me in clinic. I'll take care of things. And what I saw in there was what it basically looks like a bunch of grape clusters. It's a whole bunch of placental tissue. It's called a molar pregnancy. And there's no embryo in this case. Yeah. And immediately I said, oh my gosh, guys, I'm so sorry. Let me show you what I'm seeing here. I'm not seeing an embryo, and I'm also seeing these other things. Let me go and get my attending. Why don't you just get situated, take some deep breaths, and if you want me to bring you some water or tea, I'm happy to do that. Whatever, right? I'm just doing my best. And I went to get my attending, and she walked in and said, "Oh yeah, that's a molar pregnancy. That's got to come out." And then put the sheath down, the wand down, and walked out. And they went green. Yeah. So the grief process started the moment that I told them the news. Like, it's a part of the process of mourning the loss of any pregnancy. But then the next thing out of my mouth does not have to be, oh, you know what? This happens a lot. We see this all the time, 15 to 20% of the time. You didn't do anything wrong. Like, they're not even hearing that. It's like getting the big cancer word thrown at you. And then we talk about all the plan. Like, you need to slow the pace down here, slow the roll, because even that common miscarriage is potentially the source of a very, very deep wound that they're going to carry with them if we don't take responsibility for how we show up and how we, human back and forth with them.
Very much so. Very much so. And just because it's common, it's their first time. Right. And so that makes a really big difference. Is you are given an opportunity to reframe that loss the moment you acknowledge it's happening. Yeah. And so to reframe a diagnosis, to reframe a loss, is such a gift in being present with them in their mourning, in their grief. I think that is happening. To do it with kindness and compassion is happening less frequently, and more people are feeling isolated and alone in that experience.
In your work with doctors or meeting people along the way on this journey of your own, have you have you sort of gained an appreciation for, I mean, obviously humans are doctors. They have the same fear of mortality that many of us, lay people do or whatever. Um, but why is it that a doctor, struggles with just the basic, the diagnosis and the sort of relaying of information around a miscarriage or around a congenital anomaly that's incompatible with life? Like,
Yeah.
what is it really that keeps us so armored and guarded against that human experience of interacting with somebody who's about to hear maybe the most devastating thing of their lives?
I've got lots of thoughts. I would say there's an element of cloak because of the dynamic and the authority that plays out in that relationship. And so, how much can you be allowed to show your vulnerability? And how
Right.
much going into that vulnerability on a very routine, regular basis from patient to patient to patient can you allow yourself without exposing yourself to a certain amount of burnout ultimately, which is, I think, it's a moral burnout that's happening with physicians more than anything else, because what research tells us, Nathan, is that physicians, when given the same circumstances as their patients, will typically choose less intervention than what they're offering.
Right. Right. Isn't that
And
interesting?
so, yeah, so and even some of the research sort of says, like, if it is that in the last 25 years that hasn't changed. So even as technology has changed, physicians routinely choose less intervention than what they feel compelled to offer. So there's an element of like wearing a cloak, understanding you are an authority, not being able to go into that space of vulnerability to such an extent that you can protect yourself. So not actually
Mm.
understanding, how can I expose my vulnerability and be compassionate and not have that
Right.
basically empty my cup on a very routine basis, And so I think that there is that element. And I think because what's happened is that patients are not going in to interactions with their physicians feeling like they have an element of control.
Right.
So then the burden is placed on the physician to essentially dominate most of that conversation, dominate most of that interaction, because they haven't been given permission to do anything other than that.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I've not had a conversation with a palliative care or hospice doc that doesn't have some kind of traumatic response associated with the fact that they've been in that suite where there is a human being that is attached to machines. And if the machines were not there, that human being would not be alive. And the family is putting the pressure on, and
Right.
they're, even just from a religious perspective saying, well, we can't pull the plug because it's against our religion.
Right.
Except when you talk to religious leaders, they actually say that that's not actually true to form. I mean, so we've got a lot of dynamics that are playing out that place physicians in that classically God type role that most human beings don't want to have to care. Like, that's a heavy cloak to wear. That's a
Mm.
very heavy burden that we're placing on our physicians.
Yeah. Yeah. Without giving them
You know?
really the skills. Frankly, I had to take bedside manner training. It was like a part of, residency training. We're going to do
Yeah.
a lunchtime workshop on bedside manner. It's like, guys, we haven't figured out bedside manner yet. Like, and now we're
Well,
expecting,
I mean,
yeah,
totally. In the
yeah.
UK, they're teaching what's called compassionomics to physicians. And there's actually like compassionomics is actually the name of a book written by a physician who's teaching physicians to be compassionate,
Gosh,
right?
isn't that wild? Huh?
And even just the conversation, like because I picked up the book, I'm like, this is fascinating. Like, this feels like completely foreign from a human perspective. And so in compassionomics, it was telling physicians that patients experience better health outcomes when they have a compassionate physician,
Let's unpack that. Let's go down that
right?
rabbit hole.
Right. So patients have better outcomes when they have a compassionate physician. When a physician exhibits compassion, patients actually heal a little bit faster, tend to take a little bit more agency over their situation, tend to appreciate their situation a little bit more, tend to feel well supported, right? How is it that we're in that place, right?
Mm.
And I think, just like we sort of talk about physicians not feeling comfortable to expose vulnerability, that's a bigger picture. It's like humans, if we're trying to support somebody who's going through something horrible. So let's say this family that I was talking about, whose little baby is going to die. It's how, we tend to not want to talk about it. We tend to not want to use this little one's name afterwards. We tend to not want to bug them because they've got too much to deal with. We don't know how to support them. Do they really, should I be sending food or money, or like, what do they need? Oh, well, I'm not. It becomes really uncomfortable. But the reality is that I think when we as human beings allow our vulnerability and our truest emotional selves to be seen, that is where compassion lies. It's where the siblings, actually, like the parents who show their grief to their children, we end up raising compassionate children when they have been exposed to vulnerability, when there has been a true honesty of emotions, because ultimately children are, I think they're closer to spirit. It wasn't that long ago that they were there. And so our ability to be compassionate humans is a byproduct of our ability to have seen it play out in others and us to actually have that experience ourselves. Well, if physicians aren't seeing compassion in their mentors, in their, when they were a resident, if they never actually saw it done in a manner with which they were protected, they understood how to regulate their own nervous system in that way, people could come and take what they needed from them without it tapping them. It's like, if they never saw that modeled, why would we expect that that's what they're going to offer the families that they're working with?
I definitely have some thoughts about that. The first is that I don't think people realize that OBGYNs also train in GYN oncology. We are not GYN oncologists, but we're the people who find the thing that needs to be referred there. And
Right.
we then put that on our partners in the GYN oncology clinic. And again, for those who don't know, most of the GYN cancers are not going to go very well. The uterine carcinomas, if it's early, we can remove the uterus. Maybe we've saved something there. The ovaries, we don't usually find that until it's stage 3 or later. It's usually going to be a very, very hard path forward. And cervical cancer is just a horrible disease to watch somebody die from. I have a close friend who's near the very end of her life with cervical cancer. And of course, I've cared for so many of these people at UC San Diego, where people were seeking out 4th lines of chemo out of desperation from like Dubai. I mean, like, I have seen every stretch of this conversation in every tendril. And the GYN oncologists, when I was a young student there, my dad passed away in med school, and I remember his conversations with the palliative care team, like Bob Arnold, like the OGs from UPMC, and some of these guys that were doing this before it was even an accredited specialty for as a subspecialty for somebody like me. I remember hearing their conversations and my dad opening up in ways that I was like, that is fascinating what they were able to do. It was like emotional Aikido to get my dad to feel safe and to trust in his team and to open up about his existential dread about what was coming around the corner. And in the same time, he's pooping his pants. He's got no dignity left. And so they did this incredible job. And I learned from just that experience to realize that, people who come into the GYN oncology clinic who are diagnosed with an advanced cancer probably could use a palliative care consult. And I started popping consults in every single person who came in the door. And my attendings compared me to Patch Adams. That wasn't a compliment. They said Patch Adams was a terrible doctor. And if you continue to, like, they didn't like that I was placing these consults because it felt to them like I was giving up on the client. On the patient.
But that is, I mean, that's a bias that exists within the system. Why would we expect that bias doesn't exist outside the system?
Absolutely.
The reality is palliative care and palliative physicians are experts in pain management. You understand as a physician that it takes different pharmaceutical intervention to mitigate pain in different organ types.
Right.
And different palliative, a palliative care physician understands what the possibility of pain mediation is if it's, if it's a uterine cancer versus if it's, brain, or if it's different tissue types require different types of pharmaceutical intervention. And the reality is that palliative, by definition, changes the relationship with that individual as being, it's not just about the person that is most likely going to die. It's about the relationship of that person and everybody else that they love.
That's right.
So palliative is, and we know this. I mean, the most recent, president of the United States, he's been on hospice for, what is it, like 10 months now? And the reality is that people live longer when under the care and oversight of a palliative physician. They live longer. And so I think what you're experiencing is that's a bias that is inside the system. Of course, it's going to actually
Right.
limit people's ability to have that level of support for their entire familial unit, whatever that is. And because, I mean, we started this conversation by saying people are afraid of the pain, right? They don't understand that the more, in order to take care of the pain, the consequence of more pain medication is consciousness, right? And so when you choose more pain medication, you choose to be less conscious to your experience.
Right.
Physicians understand that. Palliative care physicians understand that. The general public does not.
Yeah. The GYN oncologists, a lot of people were beating them up over the years, like, oh, they're so terse, they're so direct and all this. And I actually tried to they really, really made my life hard, I have to say. And I've held a lot of resentment for years, but I've also tried to be compassionate, realizing that these are people who went into a profession where you're hailed for saving the day, and they very, very infrequently save anything. They may buy you a couple years, but you may also be fraught with neuropathies and all sorts of other issues as a consequence of their high doses of cisplatin and whatever, right? So I tried to hold a lot of compassion for them. And, they said, we don't like to give up on hope here. And one thing that you can probably, that you probably use in your own language is like, hey, we're hoping for a miracle, or we don't want to give up on hope. Okay, well, what are we hoping for? What's the miracle look like? Okay, what if that doesn't happen? Is there something else we can hope for? Is there some other miracle that might emerge? Maybe instead of your baby living forever or your dad living forever, what if maybe if we can't get your baby to live beyond, let's say, an hour of life, what if the miracle would be that baby is loved unconditionally for the entire time that he or she is here, and that they're not suffering from seizures and asphyxiating and pain or whatever, right? Reframing that is a skill that I think every physician needs to learn, because it actually allows that person to reconnect with the humanity of what we're doing here. Like, us doctors are not just technicians for the pharmaceutical industry. That's what it has become. But we don't have to do that. We can actually decide to just come at this from the lens of humanity.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a palliative care doc. Her name is Dr. Sammy Winemaker. The terminology that she uses, it's the title of her book, is hope for the best, plan for the rest.
Love that.
And it is exactly that. It's not about giving up hope. Hope is all you have. I mean, I remember years and years ago being at in the days of Lance Armstrong, being at a Livestrong event, and that was the sign. It was like, hope. That's all you have. When you were given a diagnosis, that's all you have is hope. And nobody gets to take that away. But where we fall short is it is very oftentimes taken away by these promises of more time without the conversation of how would you like to spend those days? And at what point does quality of life supersede quantity?
Yeah.
And what is that quantity going to actually look like? Right.
Yeah.
And so, and what does planning include? Like, that's where I would sort of say, like, that's where I think, end of life doulas are doing some really amazing work. It's a huge scope, because it's not just vigiling or being present with families in those last days. It's also about the planning piece of, when do you want to opt out, and how do you define a good death, and what kind of conversations do you need to engage your physician in, and where do you give your physician the permission to allow you the opportunity to choose quality of life and let them off the hook for extending quantity.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it is up to you to give them permission to follow your lead in terms of what your wishes actually are. Otherwise, their only choice for a physician is to keep doing what they know how to do, which is extend quantity of life.
Yeah.
Right. No physician is ever going to choose quality of life. That would end up in a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Unless you've actually done the planning associated with letting them and their liability off the hook in order for you to get what you want for you and your family and your little one,
Right.
or whatever the situation actually is.
Right.
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 And so whether or not it's, I teach people to write a letter to their doctor. If you have to make these decisions, here's what I want you to know about how our family wants to be delivered bad news. This is the people in my family that I don't want you to share this information with. If you have to make a decision between this or this is what we want as a family. These are our cultural or spiritual beliefs. I'm asking that that you care for us in that way. I just did an end of life symposium on Indigenous practices. The worst scenario would be to close a window in a room where someone is expected to die. Right. But you have to know what to ask for, and you have to give your physicians permission to not assume that role that they believe they are supposed to be standing in for 100% of these circumstances where life is limited.
Yeah. I want to ask you, I wanted to share a little something, because when you were speaking about you were speaking to pain and our sort of relationship to pain. Most of us in medicine would say that person's in pain, we need to treat that pain.
Right.
And of course, there's a variety of different types of pain, which are not just physical. And of course, there's various types of physical pain that you refer to organically in the body. But when I was a fellow, I was called down to the ICU, and I looked in the window. And before I went into the room, it was this Asian family. That's all that I could tell, and they had a couple, obviously maybe some Buddhist, artifacts around the room, and they were trying to make it friendly there. But it looked like a very young woman in the bed. And the nurse came to me before I went in the room and said, "Doc, I don't know what to do with this family. They won't let me give pain meds." And she looked at her, and she was grimacing. She was fighting through some stuff. And I said, "Okay, well, thank you for letting me know. Let me go talk to them, and then we'll figure out what to do," because I certainly want to understand like their perception of pain. And I went into the room, and it was a family member rushed over to me and said, "Hi, doctor. Thank you for coming. The nurse is really concerned because, we'll call her, I don't know, Angela. Angela has been very clear that she doesn't want any pain medication." And I said, "Okay, well, here's what I'm seeing. It looks like she is grimacing a lot, and her brow's all furrowed, and like she clearly is uncomfortable." And they said, "Yeah, we know that. We don't want her to suffer." And I was like, "Well, no, they said, they didn't say we want her to suffer, but they said," oh gosh, how did they word it? No, what they said is, yes, she's working through suffering.
Yeah.
And there was no evaluation or qualification of the suffering. It was, she is suffering. So then of course I asked, well, tell me about, suffering in your culture or your tradition. And I don't know what guided me here. It was just a learning opportunity where I happened to get it right. And they said, well, she's has been a devout Buddhist her whole life. And ever since this thing happened to her, she's been very clear with us that I want to live out, a part of living out my Dharma is to actually be connected consciously to the process of suffering. And this concept of suffering, even in Buddhist tradition, if you go and read the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's a pretty complicated story. But all that I needed to learn in that moment was that if I were to give her something that was going to take her out of that suffering, which may not be my value system, that I would actually potentially be doing more harm than good.
I love that you've asked this question because it's such a tender one. And it is a core value system, not just a spiritual space, but it's also like at what level of intervention potentially interferes with the innate wisdom of the body, and also with the dissolution of spirit and soul outside of that physical vessel, right? So when I said, there's labor involved at the beginning of life, well, there's also labor involved at the end. We just don't ever talk about it. There's a historian, a medical historian out of the UK named Joanna Burke, and she wrote a book about pain. And basically the conversation was, how did we get from prayer to painkillers? Like, how is it that we became so averse to
Yes.
pain as a
Yeah.
human being, as opposed to pain being a human experience? And then let's jump right straight to end of life. We don't talk about, like, our relationship with things like food obviously changed. Food is for living, it's not for dying.
Right.
Except we talk about a feeding tube instead of artificial nutrition.
Mm.
Well, does a dying body need nutrition? Who's that for? What's that for?
Yeah.
And can the organs actually take that amount when they're in the process of shutting down? Right?
Yeah.
Death is a dehydrating process. So do we really need the IV to hydrate when those organs actually don't have the capacity to flush
Yeah.
or filter? And then this really from a pure, it's your science head to mine. It's, well, doesn't it make sense that the body has the capacity to titrate the chemistry to allow us to drop into that level of consciousness that allows us to leave? Well, what happens if we actually intervene with that natural shift in biochemistry that is meant to naturally, like as calcium levels go up, consciousness comes down? Well, doesn't it allow us the
Yeah.
possibility of actually bathing in our own biochemistry to reconcile life and living to allow us to leave?
Yeah.
Right? And have we gotten so far away from that we are like, I'll take one step back. There is a very well-known hospice nurse that has a huge following on Instagram. And about a year ago, she posted a video and she was bawling in the car after going to a house visit. And very much like you, she arrives and her whole commentary of this video was this person in pain, the family not wanting to intervene, the person actually, even in the conversation she's telling me that she's having with this man who says, I don't want pain medication. Like, I actually really just want to be with my own experience.
Yeah.
And she was traumatized because she felt like she actually said this. She was like, why would he, like, she couldn't get over herself in terms of, like, he needs pain medication, and why would he not choose the pain medication, and why would the
Yeah.
family let him be in pain? And the reality is that, of course, it's painful to leave.
Yeah.
And what level of consciousness, like when I said, there is a fear of being dead. Well, we also know in end of life that there is a process that when the body is shutting itself down, there is what's called the life review. Like, if you have been with people who are dying, there is a moment where they speak to the people on the other side. They have one foot in this world and one in another. For me, when my dad was dying, and I remember really clearly him speaking to people who had passed before him,
Yeah.
for him, there was some level of comfort that they were going to be welcoming him. His ability to actually dance in this world and the next was part of his preparation to leave. Well, is part of that, sort of people hanging on and waiting for the one loved one to show up and all of these kind of like experiences that we hear of? I believe that we're removing the possibility of us dancing in this world and the next and reconciling and reviewing our life and doing the last piece of putting things in a bow and reconciling, being okay with our legacy that we've left behind.
Yeah.
The more we mediate pain, the more we place somebody in some other place. I'm not sure they're getting the opportunity to be with human suffering, to be with the process of the innate wisdom of the body shutting it down. And not everybody would want that. But I know for my family members and the people that I love, when I've said, please don't intervene, and if it's hard for you to watch me in pain, then do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, because I'm not afraid of my pain.
In some regards,
Right.
it's like, who are we trying to save them from?
Right.
Like,
And I'm
we're doing it for
responsible.
us. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm responsible. Like I am responsible for reconciling this life and living. I'm responsible for doing the hard work of getting myself out of here too.
Yeah.
I don't need anybody else to, this hospice nurse, I don't want you to, like, you need to deal with your shit. Let me deal with my responsibility, which is getting out.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah, I think we've really, like, from a cultural perspective, we really believe that we should not be in pain ever. And it doesn't mean there's not a role for pharmaceuticals to do that, because there's definitely a time for that. But if the choice to give people who are dying pain medication is to make you feel better because you are struggling with watching their struggle, then that's something totally different.
Can I share another little story? I like to communicate through stories, because sometimes I think people are able to connect to this particular story in such a delightful way, a very juicy way. There was a woman who came in. I was a chief resident, meaning I was in my 4th year, and she came in and had 2 little girls and her husband with her, and her waters had opened, 32 weeks. So for those out there who don't know, that's a very premature baby that's going to require quite a bit of support in the NICU. So we, sound the alarm. There's good reasons to have hospitals and OBGYNs and all the interventions, but we kept her on the unit. We were watching carefully, and sure enough, this baby came a day or 2 after she came in. And the baby went to the peds team, which is always there when you have a preterm baby, because there's very likely a good chance that a tube is going to have to go in the throat to keep their lungs open and all of this. So anyways, the woman had a small hemorrhage, which is not uncommon with PPROM, as we call it, pre-labor or premature pre-labor rupture of membranes. And I was dealing with that, but I didn't hear a baby crying. And I was like, what's going on? Like, did the baby pass away? What's happening here? And clearly there was enough activity. It wasn't like somber. It was like, it was heightened. It was your sympathetic, like, we're in go mode here, right? Thank God for our sympathetic nervous system at times. Maybe we'll get into some polyvagal in a minute, but they brought the troops. This is at Kaiser Permanente. This is one of the biggest, baddest hospital systems in the world. But they kept filing in more and more people. And I was like, God, what is happening over there? Eventually, somebody told the mom, hey, we got to take the baby to the operating room. We're having a hard time getting a tube in the airway to get an artificial airway. So they rushed the baby over there. By the time, her bleeding's fine, we get over there, and the baby is being operated on. They have the head and neck doctors. They have the pediatric surgeons. They have the whole cavalry's up there. And it turns out that this baby was born without a trachea. So they came out, and there's no fix for this. But they came out and said, here's what we found. What do you guys want to do? The MFM's there. I'm there. Some other OBGYNs. Like, we're all standing there like, there's nothing we can do. This baby's going to die. Unless we want to try to do some sort of artificial airway that is not going to be sustainable, but like, hey, it'll buy us time. At least we tried everything. There's that term. And of course, we can't accept death until we have thrown $1 million at the problem. And so death not being a failure of the medical sciences, we were presented with this very unique opportunity to tell the family what was going on and give them the options. And what she decided was, I just want to hold her.
Yeah.
So we've got the operating room, and anybody who's been in an operating room knows what that environment's like. It's bright lights, it's cold, so people are putting blankets on her, they're checking her blood pressure, they're doing all the postnatal stuff as well. And there's instruments being put away as this little girl is taking her final breaths. And eventually, if I may use an expletive, she said, I will never forget this. Can you just leave us the fuck alone?
Yeah.
And it was, everybody filed out except for me and one of the nurses, and I just stood there. And what I realized is the busyness that was happening in that room was a consequence of the individuals being so uncomfortable with the reality of what was happening that they couldn't even hold space and be present for the moments of life that this little baby girl was going to have here. And all that the mom and dad wanted to do was love her and be close to her without the cacophony of noise. And maybe we can talk about this, next, but even in counseling, that other woman I described recently who had the baby that died, in the bath, and they had a home birth. It was amazing. That baby, I said, my priority here, guys, is not to do the meds and to do all this stuff. My priority is, what can we do for that little baby, your little girl, to feel safe? And so, this informed consent piece is a thing we won't get into right now, but I always tell my colleagues, like, listen, if you have a hard time with a person making a decision, so much so that you need to strip them of their bodily autonomy, then that's on you. Like, you need to go for a run, go get therapy, like, go do something, because you're actually hurting people in non-measurable ways, but things that come up many, many years later, if not generationally. This is passed down. So anyways, I'll stop there. What are some things that come up for you, given your experience with this work?
I would say we need to not shy away from the honesty of the situation and honoring that family, honoring that person, using the child's name, giving them the opportunity to just, they're not close to accepting the reality of the loss. So allow them to be with the purest human emotion of love, right? And connection as much as possible. So in that moment of really just allowing, whether it's the last breath or being in that space of connection, that is the only time that they have. And again, that there is no rush to take that little body and being away, giving them the time to reconcile, even just if it's within that space. There is no, death is not a medical event.
Right.
At that point, it's not an emergency, right?
Slow
And
down.
so, no, and just to be really present in that moment, because it is such a pure, clean experience. It's like we are used to, like normally it's like that little, that the clarity of looking at a newborn and seeing just the beauty in that moment of first eye contact and just that and all of the promise of the future. When that is so incredibly close to the beauty that exists in that room when someone dies, we have to acknowledge that beauty on both ends.
Yeah.
Right. And make space for it, and be willing to still smile when there's a smile, or be present with the memory that's being shared, in that moment, and make space for grief to happen right away. Make to say what they want to say, to be with that, that little one in this side before it becomes a relationship with the other side.
Yeah.
Most religions do have this space where, and even just, and you may or may not be familiar, but this fall, brand new research came out looking at people who have had near-death experiences, so NDEs.
Yeah.
And what was so significant about it, Nathan, is that people who they basically, people came into the emergency room, went into cardiac arrest, they hooked them all up, but they also put, little, we're going to check brain waves while we're actually trying to resuscitate this person. And then the people who survived, they interviewed them. And this is where this research came from. And what was so stunning about it is that there was brain waves far beyond the timing of when death medically occurred.
Yeah. Clinical death was announced. Right.
An hour later. And the summary from a medical perspective was, I guess when we're resuscitating, we should be treating these individuals as if they're alive and not dead. The take home for me in that research is that little girl may have taken her last breath, but everything we know right now to date, based on current research, is that she was still very much in that room.
Yeah.
Very much present. So whether it's the Buddhists that continue to have the conversations, or whether or not it's the indigenous that, then go into the process of, whether it's cutting the hair and the ceremony associated with that the conversations that are part of their process that happens once the last breath is taken, we as a culture are so far removed from that opportunity. And so, for this family, it's given them the opportunity that, and even just sharing, she's still here with us. Take the time that you have the conversations you want to have.
Yeah.
Tell her what you want her to know. Fostering that connection in those moments.
Yeah.
Is healing the trauma of that moment as well. It's to be actively engaged in the grief process in that moment, I think, changes that experience for that whole family. Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to Jenkinson's work, who wrote a great book for those listening called Die Wise. It's very, very beautiful to read. I mean, it's a very well written narrative kind of book. And Stephen shares a story about a little girl that he was consulted on when he was back in his words, the death trade, which is this sort of hospital-based, just call it palliative care, right? It's seen as these people that walk around and take hope away, and we're arbiters of this negotiation around mortality, I guess. And he went to the little girl who was in like a pediatric ICU bed, and she had shared something about so, hey, he said, hey, how are you doing with all this? Oh, I feel really good. I'm dying. And he said, oh, really? Does that worry you? Like, no, I've lived a really good life. And she was like 9 or 10 years old. I mean, she's not 6, but she was like 9 or 10 years old. And he said, oh, well, tell me. Well, 3 really, really great things happened this past year. I got to ride a horse. And that was just awesome. And he was like, wow, okay, what else was it? I don't remember the second one, but the third one that she ended with is, I got to kiss a boy, and it was a boy that I liked. And so for her, she was beaming with sunshine and pride and just living this, sort of the type of life that we all as kids used to live, but she has lived it fully in her eyes. So again, back to this, redirecting the conversation around what does a good life look like? Forget about good death even. Like, what does a good life look like? Let's start there. And reframing it in a way, like you said about like a little baby or something like that, they're still there. Like, they're with you. If you want to dress them up in like the clothes that grandma made them, or if you want to record a video or record their little, the first little baby sounds they make and put it into a teddy bear, like, there are plenty of ways to honor this baby and to remember that you still are a mother. Even if your baby dies and you have no other children, you are still a mother. You got to love a baby for 9.5 months. Even if they died one day of life, you still are a mother. And it doesn't check all the boxes, but there is a way for us to reframe this. And it may come as easy for us to talk about. I don't know if you've lost a family member in that way, or I mean, I think we all have. I feel like to acknowledge you haven't ever lost somebody that, that hurt you so much, like, it's kind of like you need to start loving a little bit more deeply with your friends and family. But we haven't lost a child. So it seems easy to just pontificate on this. But I've also seen some families do this in a way that I'm like, God, if I could ever be that heart-centered and selfless, actually even selfish. Like, I want to be with my baby and I want to love on her and smell her and kiss her until she dies. Like, maybe that is selfish, but like, good on you, because all you're doing is loving your child. And that can't be replaced. It doesn't matter what the doctors and the nurses and everything offer you. What matters most is that you get to actually be with your daughter, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, in that exact space of beauty and connection, that's really what life is all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're all looking for, is to be loved and to be in that presence. And so, yeah, it brings it back to like, to the core, who are we as human beings, and how can we support each other fully in not just the celebratory moments of life, but in the difficult ones too.
Yeah.
Because it's also living, and when we have experienced that level of, when we've been near somebody dying, when we've been and lost somebody that we've loved, then it makes life more precious, doesn't it?
It does.
It's we take things less for granted. These families that you're talking about, they will be celebrating so much more of those individual moments, like being on the horse and, providing that opportunity for bliss and happiness in, in their next child. They will always approach that moment very differently, having had the
That's right.
experience.
Yeah.
Of losing a child. And so, yeah, there is such beauty in that space, when we're willing to be with our heartache, when we're willing to be and recognize that too is the human experience.
Right. Yeah. Actually sitting with that pain. I heard it described once that like grief is kind of this like monster lurking in the closet. And the monster is just going to come and sit next to your bed and just wait until you want to look at him. And every single night you can, alcohol, cannabis, benzodiazepines, whatever, just go to bed, go to bed, go to bed. The monster's just going to be waiting there until you're ready. And it's actually,
and it's learning to live with it. Just learning to live with it. It's never going to go away. You're not going to outgrow it. It's not going to, it's not going to shrink to such an extent that you're going to feel a level of shame that you don't think about it. It's just not the way it happens.
Right.
You will always be with your grief. It's just a matter of reorganizing it and finding its place and
befriending it maybe in some way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I my dad died when I was, he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor when I was just finishing up high school and died after my second year of university. And I still have a relationship with my dad. It's just doesn't look like other people's relationships. He's never not been part of my life. And moments where I want to share with him, I have. It just looks very different. And so I think if you can find that space where I feel like it was such a gift to have my father in my life for as many years as I did. And I have lived more years without him than with him at this point in my life, And so, I think I grieve the loss of the father I didn't have in certain years of my life, but I also celebrate the fact that I had this incredible human being supporting me in the first half of my life,
Absolutely.
And so I think if we can find that space of being present in support, of recognizing that our legacy as a human being, whether you are 6 days old or 60 years old, legacy isn't about what you left behind, it's how you left it. It's about the memories that, your presence created, the experience that your presence created for your family, your friends, and so I think we have to reframe our relationship with death and dying. I think, it kind of comes back to the beginning of our conversation, Nathan. We are really death illiterate. And until we come to the place of acceptance that we will all die, we don't know necessarily how or when. The moment that you may have an idea that your end is in sight, grief happens, and we must embrace it. And really, ultimately, we know that there is an innate wisdom that shuts the body down too. And we're really far from removed in understanding our responsibility and what kind of decisions could be made to create a good death for ourselves and the people we love.
So beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for today.
Yeah. I mean, this has been so lovely. I know we both have some things to get to, but as one little final quote that just came to me, it's a quote from St. Francis of Assisi. Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing that you have received, only what you have given. And I think that actually works on both sides of this conversation. Whether you're the person who's facing mortality or you're the person who's holding space for the unfolding of a loved one's mortality, that there's more to this than just the material thing, but there's also a good reason for us to not see this as a failure, but actually to see this perhaps, I don't want to say a blessing, because I don't think that's the opposite of failure, but it's an opportunity actually to really feel into the privilege of having been able to live, that now you get to do this whole life review. Like, what a gift. What a gift. And
death is not a failure of medicine.
That's right.
It's a reality of life and living. And the sooner we embrace it, the sooner we take responsibility for being, more curious than afraid, of honoring where our fear resides. The more we take that into each and every experience and relationship we have, the more we can support people in our community. Death is a community event. And when we as a community are willing to embrace the fact that there is a role for all of us in supporting those that are mourning, and in that bereavement, the better off we'll all be in our own experience when it happens.
Amen. Tamara, I could probably talk to you for hours. I really, really enjoyed this time with you. Tell us a little bit about what people can find if they go to your website, which is consciousdeath.org.
Right. So I do a lot of death education, but I also give experiences that allow people to be with their own experience to, to find where fear resides as it relates to death. I do deep mortality meditations called living funeral ceremonies. I help people with the planning part. So when I said, hope for the best, but plan for the rest, really evaluate your values and put some plans in place if somebody has to make a decision for you later on. And then the third part is I am a coffin weaver. So in part of that grief process, from an eco-sustainability perspective, we have the possibility of making choices in our death that are incredibly respectful to this planet. So I weave willow coffins and use that as an opportunity for me to be congruent, but also to provide people with the opportunity to be present with that experience. And so when you hop on my website, those are sort of the venues with which I am supporting people right now. Thank you.
Oh, it's so very much my pleasure. And if there are ways that I can support you in your nonprofit, please let me know. I presume it's a nonprofit. You have got to let me know, because this is actually what I was called to do. Birth is a consequence of me having been called to death, which of course I think you understand probably as much as anybody. And so I thank you. And if there's, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be really intrigued by this conversation. But guys, if you are listening, if you're feeling anything coming up that's very confronting, sit with that and just close your eyes and just breathe it in and breathe it out, because there's probably something there. There's probably something there for you to digest. And I hope that you'd reach out to Tamara or myself if you need any additional support.
Yeah, on my website, I have a downloadable on what is a good death. And it's really just some prompts to just start you thinking about that process. Like, how would you define it? What does that actually look like?
Yeah.
And it's in those small little acts that change our relationship with our own lives, but also can serve as an impetus to put some plans in place to ensure that, there's no guarantees you're going to get exactly what you want. But if you don't do any planning, the likelihood you'll get what you want is very small.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Amazing. Tamara, you are a gift. You're like, you just have this rich sort of treasure trove of wisdom and experience. So thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Thank you so much.